It can be put in another way. How Charles Dickens exposes the specific social ills of his times in Oliver Twist. So the question might be set in either of these two ways. So let us look at the question from this angle, that as we know, Oliver Twist was published. It was serialized in Bentley's Miscellany, and we know that it was published in 1838. And this novel is notable. It is notable for its portrayal of the criminals. The criminals who resided in certain areas of the city of London, and they constituted the underworld of London. And Dickens had portrayed their sordid lives in this great city of London. And as I had told you in my previous class, when we were doing the introduction, I was giving you an introduction to this novel, and also I was analyzing the character of Oliver. I told you that Dickens had made his purpose quite clear in the preface to the third edition of his novel, which was published in the year 1841. And Dickens had already anticipated, so he had thought about the objections that might be raised. And I'm quoting from the preface, quote, "some very high moral quarters," unquote. So people from some very high moral quarters would object to this portrayal of criminals in the novel. And he goes on to explain that and I'm quoting again, quote, "it seems a very coarse and shocking circumstance that some of the characters in these pages are chosen from the most criminal and degraded of London's population. That Sykes is a thief and Fagin a receiver of stolen goods, that the boys are pickpockets, and the girl is a prostitute. It appeared to me that to draw a knot of such associates in crime as really do exist, to paint them in all their deformity, in all their wretchedness, in all the squalid poverty of their lives, to show them as they really are, forever skulking uneasily through the dirtiest paths of life, with the great black ghastly gallows closing up their prospect to turn them where they may. It appeared to me that to do this would be to attempt a something which was greatly needed, and which would be a service to society, and therefore I did it as I best could," unquote. So in this long paragraph, as you can see, Dickens has very clearly enunciated, he has made it quite clear what his purpose was, and he wanted to do this. He was interested in doing this, and he wanted to show as we had seen, how virtue would triumph over vice. And this is something that was greatly needed, as Dickens says. It was greatly needed, and it would be a kind of a service to society. So we know that Dickens, in most of his novels, he has exposed the social evils of the Victorian age. And in this novel also, that is Oliver Twist, Dickens also brings before us the workhouse system for the poor people, or the paupers, who came under the Poor Law, the new Poor Law, as it was called, of 1834, that was passed in the year 1834. And the general squalid and, you can say, insanitary dwelling places of the poor. And Dickens, as we know from his biography, he had to learn about poverty in the hard way, as we know that how his father had been imprisoned in the Marshalsea prison for his debts, not being able to pay off his debts. And he was a poor child himself. He had to work in this blacking factory when he was a young boy. So thus we can understand his interest in the poor, and that interest is very much constant and quite passionate. The pity and the pain of their condition was always present before him, because he had suffered himself during his boyhood days. And he has written about this, and I'm quoting again. I'm giving you these quotations just to emphasize, or just to make you understand, rather, to see the point of view that Dickens held about the poor people, and why he was so sympathetic about the poor people. So, quote, "I have great faith in the poor. To the best of my ability, I always endeavor to present them in a favorable light to the rich, and I shall never cease, I hope, until I die, to advocate their being made as happy and as wise as the circumstances of their condition in its utmost improvement will admit of their becoming," unquote. So Dickens's purpose was to make the poor, to portray them favorably, in a favorable light compared to the rich people, and to make them as happy as was possible, considering the fact that they lived in a very unhealthy kind of a place. Now, if we look at the novel, in the first 11 chapters of Oliver Twist, Dickens is exposing the ill effects of the controversial Poor Law, which had come into effect from 1835. It was formulated in 1834, and it came into effect the next year, that is in the year 1835. Now, what was laid down in this Poor Law? What were the provisions? Now, this Poor Law, it forced the non-working and the working poor who needed public assistance into workhouses, people who were unemployed, as well as people who could work or who were working, but they were poor people and they needed some kind of public assistance. They were forced to go into the workhouses, where they would be supported more cheaply than outside. So in the workhouses, they would be looked after but in a most, cheap way, in the cheapest way possible. And by the proposed clause, if a laboring man fell sick or was deprived by other causes of his ability to support his family and required a little temporary relief, he would be driven with perhaps a large family into the workhouse, from which it would be impossible to say when he would return. So, a poor man with a large family would be driven into the workhouse if he needed some kind of financial support. And from there was almost no return for him. And that would, of course, involve a lot of hardship for the person concerned. And there would be most injurious consequences for the person, for that individual and his family. Now, with regard to widows, that is women who had lost their husbands, and to orphans or illegitimate children uh, who needed some temporary relief, which could have been administered by the discretion of persons on the spot, they would be confined to the workhouse for the rest of their lives. So widows, then orphans like Oliver Twist, or illegitimate children, they would be forced to go into the workhouse. Now Dickens has described sarcastically how Mrs. Mann, who was in charge of the baby farm, ran it. And in the novel, there is a very sarcastic description how this Mrs. Mann, who was in charge of the baby farm where Oliver was sent after his birth, how she ran this establishment. Quote, "The elderly female was a woman of wisdom and experience. She knew what was good for children, and she had a very accurate perception of what was good for herself. So she appropriated the greater part of the weekly stipend to her own use and consigned the rising parochial generation to even a shorter allowance than was originally provided for them." Unquote. So Dickens ironically and sarcastically describes her as a woman of wisdom and experience, and that is why how she appropriated the money for herself. The money that was provided for the upkeep or for the looking after of these orphans actually was appropriated by this woman, and she spent very little for the nourishment of these boys. Now the sad fact is that as we see in the novel, how these orphans were treated unkindly. In the baby farm, as we see, Oliver, during his infant years, when he was a baby, he is vividly described how when he goes with Mr. Bumble, the parish beadle, to meet the members of the board, he is walking with a slice of bread in his hand and the little brown cloth parish cap on his head, and he was led away from the wretched home where one kind word or look had never lighted the gloom of his infant years. So during his stay in this baby farm, he had not had a single look of kindness, and however he was attached to his friends. and he was attached to his companions, among whom was one boy called Dick, with whom he was good friends. Now, they were the only friends he had known. And in his loneliness of his heart, in the loneliness of his heart, he understood that there was no one now to think about him or love him. So it is a very sad and very pitiful picture of this little boy being removed from the baby farm, and he is being taken by Mr. Bumble to meet the board of members of the board of directors. And Dickens is criticizing the administration of the board, how the members they were really heartless and they were insensitive creatures, and how they reacted to the boy's, that is Oliver's, unhappy state. And Dickens describes these people as very sage, that is wise, deep philosophical men. And when they came to turn their attention to the workhouse, they found out at once what ordinary folks would never have discovered. The poor people liked it. It was a regular place of public entertainment for the poorer classes. So they thought that the poor people liked the workhouses. They wanted to stay there because they could get free food and drink there. That is why. So that was a kind of a wrong perception in the minds of the members of the board of directors, and that the boys there spend really happy lives. And there, as we know, how Oliver was punished when he dared to ask for more food. And the reaction of the master when Oliver asks for more is another piece of, irony and sarcasm on the part of the novelist. And Dickens describes how this man, who was a fat, healthy man, he turned very pale when Oliver asked for more. And he was extremely surprised, and almost he was stunned at the audacity of Oliver, how he dared to ask for more gruel. And as Dickens describes the condition of these people, the assistants were paralyzed with wonder, the boys with fear. So this is another sarcastic way how Dickens describes the situation, that a little boy is asking for more food, and this had never happened. So the master was stunned, his assistants were paralyzed with wonder, and the boys, that is Oliver's companions, they became extremely frightened. Now the condition is abominable there, as we can see. But later on, this is the portrayal of the workhouse conditions, the baby farm, everything that we find at the beginning of the novel. But then Dickens shifts his attention to the underworld of London. Now, criminals and criminal behavior was also a major theme for this novel. And Dickens, after exposing the abysmal condition of the workhouse, and the, you know, how the board of members in the board of directors were cruel, they were insensitive, and the portrayal of Mr. Fang, uh, who is really a cruel character. He actually says to Oliver that, do not try to make a fool of me. That is, that Oliver was feigning, or he was acting. So, of course, the magistrate, the police magistrate, he is also criticized, and the entire system is criticized when the artful dodger, as we see in the last part of the novel, how he criticizes the judge by saying, quote, "This ain't the shop for justice," unquote. So he does not expect any kind of justice. Now Dickens, as I was saying, that he also exposes criminal activities, crimes, and he exposes the vice and crime which were rampant during his time. Now Fagin the Jew, as we see him, he carries on his activities. He trains a band of young boys in the art of pickpocketing, and however, he is always on the lookout for recruiting young boys like Oliver, who is taken to Fagin's den by Jack Dawkins, or the Artful Dodger, when the Artful Dodger finds him a little outside London. He meets him and he takes Oliver to Fagin's house. So we can see that the Artful Dodger, then Charlie Bates, all these young boys are being trained by Fagin to become pickpockets, and they have already somewhat mastered the art. Now Fagin himself is a receiver of stolen goods, as we see that he has a large quantity of jewelry, watches and other things, and these are all stolen goods which he would be selling at a good price later on, and he hoards them. He has this habit of hoarding. So the boys, actually, when they are trained by Fagin, they are doing their job of picking pockets and committing petty thefts with a degree of efficiency and thoroughness. So we can see that here these boys, they are quite adept in picking pockets. But even more dangerous than these boys, we meet William Sykes and his companion Toby Crackit. So they are housebreakers or burglars. They are adept in the art of robbery. So and they are, especially Sykes, who kills his companion Nancy. He is a very cruel man. So Sykes takes Oliver because he needs a small boy to go through the window and open the door of a house, that is the house of the Maylies, in order to break, steal things. But his attempt at housebreaking fails. Now these young boys and Oliver is placed they are placed in situations which are abhorrent to them, abhorrent to Oliver, that is. The other young boys, they, of course, they are not complaining about anything. They are quite happy to become thieves. But as Dickens portrays the situation was quite rampant in those days. The London underworld was quite active. And both Fagin and Sykes, they try to corrupt Oliver. Fagin, in fact, is the embodiment of evil. And we see how Fagin is likened or described to be stealthy like a serpent. So he is symbolical of the devil in the novel, and he is trying constantly to corrupt the young Oliver. Now, in the novel, Charles Dickens uses certain symbols to describe the social evils that were prevalent during the time. Now, among the many symbols that we can see here, operating here, those are primarily good versus evil. That is the first one. And with evil continuously trying to corrupt and exploit good, but ultimately good winning back in the end. Now, Fagin is referred to as, quote, the merry old gentleman, unquote. Now, it is implied by the writer, that is Dickens, that in his younger days, Fagin had committed a number of crimes. And now that he is old, he does not go out and commit any act of thievery himself, but he trains these young boys. And he uses them to, steal these valuable items like watches, handkerchiefs, quite fine silk handkerchiefs, and other items, jewelry like that. So he is doing that. He emerges as a kind of an old and veteran corrupter of the young boys. He is presiding over his own corner of the criminal world. And we can see also that what Dickens was trying to do, he was trying to do a service to the society of his time by making people aware of the existence of thieves and robbers who might lure young boys and girls to lives of crime. Thus, we see how Nancy, who is a victim of circumstance, she meets Rose Maylie and she describes how she had been brought up in an environment of vice and crime. It is Rose really feels pity for her. And there is another thing, the fact that the criminals, they have a kind of a network, of course, in the London underworld. They meet at different places, in the taverns and in the inns, in the most, unhealthy places. Dickens he has very uh, vividly portrayed the picture of the London slums, and the London slums have a very suffocating and infernal aspect. Now, the dark deeds and the dark passions are kind of concretely characterized by the dim rooms that are portrayed here, the pitch black night, and the governing mood in this novel is of a gloom, of terror, of brutality, and it is a somewhat pessimistic novel in this sense. So we can say that Dickens is acting as a social reformer. He is uh, introducing two sets of characters here. One set of characters, they are good, the good characters represented by Mr. Brownlow, his friend Mr. Grimwig, Mr. Brownlow's housekeeper Mrs. Bedwin, Mrs. Maylie, Rose Maylie, Harry Maylie, Dr. Losberne, all these people, and the evil characters like Fagin, Mr. Bumble, Mrs. Bumble, Mrs. Mann, Bill Sikes, the artful Dodger, uh, and the people who have been brought forward as representatives of evil, and Monks, Oliver's half brother. So he is also an evil character who wants to harm Oliver and wants that he should be hanged so that he would be able to gain the inheritance that has been left for Oliver by their late father. Now, by doing this, by pitting Oliver against Fagin, who is the embodiment of evil, we can see that Dickens sort of personifies a battle between good and evil. There are criminal acts from picking pockets, murder, that is the murder of Nancy by Sikes, and these acts happen during the 1830s in London. So Dickens is portraying the look at the real picture, and the villain William Sikes, he is hounded to death by the mob for his brutal acts, and the last days of Fagin in his cell, in his solitary cell, awaiting the sentence of death, that is also portrayed. Fagin's last night, that is the name of one of the final chapters, where Fagin sits alone in his solitary cell and thinks of his life of crime. So neither Bill Sikes nor Fagin will achieve redemption. Sikes dies ultimately, trying to run away from his guilt, and the terrified Fagin refuses to see any priest or rabbi, as the Jewish priests are called, or to pray even. He instead asks Oliver to help him to escape. In contrast, we can say that Nancy somehow redeems herself at the cost of her own life, and dies with a prayer in her mouth, on her lips, when she is struck down by Sikes. She tries her best to save Oliver when Sikes wants to kill the boy, and as we can see, this portrayal of the underworld, the London underworld, is quite potent. So, in conclusion, I think it would be not be unfair to say that the novel Oliver Twist may be looked upon as a great portrayal, a great presentation of the London social life in the 1830s, and the story of the triumph of good over evil, and that of innocence over villainy. So Dickens has criticized the contemporary social ills in this novel by depicting vividly injustice, cruelty, selfishness on the part of some of the characters, and by showing how they all meet their deaths, how they cannot succeed in their missions. Yes, Chitra, you want to ask me something? Any question? You have raised your hand. Anything that you want to ask? So if you don't have any question, I will proceed. So this is the way we can look at this question: how Dickens presents this novel as a social document, or how he is criticizing the London underworld. So I'll stop here today,